estimates. At this point, I, as the Comptroller of the great state of Maryland and the Chairman of the Board of Revenue Estimates with Treasurer Kopp and Secretary Brinkley, I would like to recognize the Acting Director of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, David Farkas, for his report to our committee. David, go ahead.
Thank you. As the Comptroller just introduced me, my name is David Farkas, Acting Director of the Bureau of Revenue Estimates. And first, before I get to my report, I would just like to express how thankful and grateful I am to the staff of the Bureau of the Revenue Estimates, members of the Revenue Monitoring Committee, for all their tireless efforts through trying times. These are all dedicated public servants, and I'm honored to present their work, our work together, to the board in my capacity as Acting Executive Secretary. They have my deep appreciation. The process of going through the Revenue Monitoring Committee is set up so that we reach a consensus from all the fiscal experts throughout the state that can then be put in front of the board and sent to the governor, so that we have revenue forecasts that have, a basis, at least at the moment in time they were created. This forecast in particular, there is always uncertainty with this kind of thing. It's very difficult to predict the future, and that is even more the case for this particular forecast. Forecasting uses past relationships and projects them forward, and the coronavirus pandemic is an unprecedented event. There's nothing like it in our modern data that we use for forecasting. And I just want to keep hitting on that point that we should expect that future forecasts could change substantially, and we should all be expecting larger variance from estimates than is typical in normal times. The revenues that the state collects depend on the macroeconomic performance of the state over the forecast period, and that is difficult to predict. In these circumstances, it relies on assumptions that have to be made before we know exactly what is going to happen. The two biggest factors of uncertainty for this forecast are both the course the pandemic will take and the federal response to the pandemic and the federal economic policy response to the recession that the pandemic has caused. In our forecast that we're presenting today, there's an assumption that monetary policy remains accommodative and that there is a second, smaller round of fiscal stimulus. And while the forecast does assume an increase in infections from the COVID-19 pandemic this winter, it does not assume a second wave to the extent that it would require a second round of shutdowns. So if any of these assumptions turn out to not be the case, then we are looking at a worse scenario than I am about to present. So with those qualifiers, I will share a presentation. The first page is the Maryland General Fund revenues for fiscal 2020 compared to the forecast. We compare it here to the March estimate adjusted for the legislative session. That was the last forecast that the board voted to approve, but we also show the May guidance that the Bureau and the Revenue Monitoring Committee worked together on to produce to incorporate the expectations of the pandemic back in April and May. And so you can see that compared to our March forecast, which did not incorporate the pandemic, revenues came in $102.2 million less. Compared to our May guidance, which did incorporate expectations surrounding the pandemic, revenues came in $822.6 million higher than they were forecast to. And so that's quite a remarkable variance from the May guidance, and quite remarkably close to a forecast made in March, which did not incorporate the pandemic. The next page shows fiscal 21 compared to the March estimate. This is a write-down of $762.6 million, but compared to the May guidance, it's a write-up of about $1.4 billion. The next page has fiscal 22. This would be the first official board forecast for fiscal 22, though we did address it back in May. And so compared to that May guidance, the estimate we're putting forward in front of the board today is a write-up of $2.1 billion. So a huge part of the issue the Bureau and the RMC had to address, and the big question for this forecast is what changed since May, and why fiscal 20 closed out so far above the May guidance. This chart shows realizations from January to August compared to the forecast we made in May, taking the S2 scenario, which was the high end of our range, compared to the September forecast that's being presented today. And the point of this chart is that it was not improvement in the labor market that explains how we collected far more revenue than was expected back in May. Employment has fared about as bad as was expected back in May. These are the worst labor market conditions in the United States since the Great Depression. And so far, the forecast has held up as far as the labor market is concerned. I will say that if the recovery in the labor market that we've seen so far to date continues, it could be that calendar 20 finishes higher than the estimated decline in our September forecast. Then in calendar 21, we expect recovery in the labor market to continue. A big difference between our expectations back in May and what we've realized to date is how earnings have held up. And this is wages, supplements to wages or benefits, business income, basically all the different classifications of earnings that workers make. And you can see that back in May, we expected earnings to decline 4% this calendar year. Year to date, earnings have stayed about the same when compared to the same period of calendar 19. So we have 0.0% growth, and the forecast we're putting forward today incorporates a decline of 0.7% before recovery in calendar 21. And so in both these cases, for the labor market and wages, there is possibly a bit of upside in that we expect in the September forecast for employment to, the recovery in employment to slow down and wage growth to decline from where it's been so far in the year. So you put all those factors together, and this really shows how unpredictable the path of personal income, which is our primary variable for forecasting income in Maryland. Back in May, we expected a decline of 1.2%. So far this year, we've seen an increase of 5.4%. That's being driven not only by how well wage income is held up given the dire circumstances, but also a massive federal response that led to a significant increase, almost a doubling for the state of Maryland, of transfer payments. And that is cash given to or spent on behalf of individuals by the federal government. And so it is really this massive federal stimulus response that has kept incomes growing in the state on the whole throughout the pandemic so far. There's two components to that federal stimulus. There's monetary policy, which has reacted substantially and quickly to the crisis to keep spending circulating throughout the economy. And that leads to shifts in spending rather than an outright decline in spending, and has forestalled a financial crisis. Whereas fiscal policy, through expanded unemployment insurance and other efforts to support business payrolls, has provided targeted benefits and assistance that has ameliorated the dire labor market conditions and led to our revenue not falling as much as was feared back in May, at least so far in this year. So if you look at those variables over the longer term of our forecast horizon, compared to May, we project a deeper fall in employment, but given the federal response and the recovery from the trough most recently experienced, we do expect a quicker labor market recovery than was forecast back in May. And this chart really shows the difference in income between the May period and what we've seen so far. So that first spike you see in personal income is being realized in the actual data. So we know that is more or less real as far as the magnitude. And so that second spike would be the assumed second round of fiscal stimulus, which again highlights how dependent this forecast is on the actions of the federal government. So I'd like to focus specifically on our two largest tax types, the sales and use tax and the personal income tax. And so for the sales and use tax, it's basically a consumption tax, and consumption fell compared to the March forecast, but it did not fall nearly as much as feared. Again, that's largely due to the federal response, the Federal Reserve keeping money circulating through the economy, the fiscal policy response to get income to affected individuals. And so as a result, income earned by or given to individuals was maintained and even grew over this time period. And so that gave people money to spend. We also saw an increase in savings. So there are, higher savings out there that could help sustain consumption over this forecast horizon. Again, spending in a lot of ways that rather than falling outright as much as we feared it would, has shifted out of impacted sectors such as recreation, leisure activities, food services, and into other sectors such as construction stores or home improvement stores. So there has been more consumption of goods than is as a proportion of total spending than is typical. And a significant amount of spending shifted to online retailers. And we now collect revenue from both remote sellers and marketplace facilitators that operate online, and much of that revenue is going to the Blueprint Fund. So we've seen a substantial shift and an increase in remote seller revenue year to date, and we forecast that trend to continue. For the personal income tax, the largest, most important component there is income tax withholding. And so withholding collections have held up rather remarkably throughout this crisis, only slowing a little bit from their prior trend. And there's several factors involved there. First is the expanded unemployment insurance program. Those benefits are taxable at the state level. And so that has supported our withholding revenue growth. We've seen growth of around 6.5% from the prior year. And if you subtract out the impact of the unemployment insurance program, that growth would be down near 3.5%, just to give people a sense of how important that's been. There are also several programs, such as the Paycheck Protection Program, which were intended to help businesses maintain their payrolls. And it does seem from our withholding collections to date that those programs taken as a whole have been fairly successful. And we see similar trends in the withholding data as in the consumption data, and that's that declines in withholding have been experienced in the food service industry, entertainment industry, while the gains have been in the federal government, employment, professional services, finance. And while these are not beneficial trends from the perspective of society, another factor holding up withholding is that losses in employment have been concentrated in lower paying industries, which means we lose less withholding growth per job lost than is typical in a recession due to the uneven impact of the pandemic. And I'll mention even that the retail sector itself, we saw an increase in withholding, and that came from grocery stores, home improvement stores, online retailers increased their employment and withholding in the state of Maryland. And so we've even seen a net increase in withholding collections from the retail sector, which of course has many businesses within it that have been suffering through the pandemic. And so again, as I start to wrap up here, I'd just like to reiterate the risks that are present in this forecast, even though we do project wage growth to slow down and have an employment outlook that could end up being worse than the actual outcome for calendar 20. There are significant downside risks to this forecast, and that of course would be a significant worsening or second wave of the pandemic, and an inadequate federal economic policy response to the shutdown in economic activity that causes. So there are significant downside risks. The outcome for these two key assumptions remains uncertain at this point in time. So I would expect, especially if there is a second wave, if there isn't significant additional stimulus, that come the next board meeting in December, we will be talking about a significant write-down. We could potentially even be talking about something on the order of magnitude of the May guidance. But it would take a few things going wrong from our assumed forecast here to get to that point. Nevertheless, I don't think it can be emphasized enough. These are forecasts from a point in time and could change substantially. As such, the board has requested an alternative downside scenario to accompany this forecast, which will be published in the next week or so. It's still being worked on as we speak. But there are two key variables I would like to highlight to give people a sense of the difference that there will be between these official figures that are being presented to the board and the alternative scenario that we will be presenting later. The official forecast we are submitting to the board today uses the macroeconomic forecast of IHS, which is a professional forecasting group that we consult with. And so the orange line is their employment forecast over the relevant time period. The blue line is from Moody's Analytics, another forecaster that we have a long-standing relationship with. And you can see that the key difference is that Moody's expects the labor market recovery to very much stall out on the latter part of this year and next year. Kind of building on that, they similarly expect the recovery in aggregate wages to stall out and even have a double dip at the end of this year and into next year. And so the alternative downside scenario is essentially a forecast based on the assumption that the recovery we've seen to date stalls out, in the third and fourth quarter of calendar 2020. And of course, we will know by December, at least have some sense whether or not that situation has come to pass, and be able to act accordingly on the forecast that the Bureau and the RMC present to the board in December. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I will turn it back to the Comptroller.
Thank you, Mr. Farkas. That was excellent. I'll just indicate the extent of the federal stimulus has just been unbelievable. $2.2 trillion, I believe, was in the first stimulus. If you had $2.2 trillion bills and laid them end to end, they would go all the way to the sun, all the way around the sun, and all the way back to Earth. It is an enormous stimulus plan. I can't agree with you more that hopefully there will be a second one, because this one has proven to be extremely beneficial to our state, and I think all the states. I just want to thank you, because revenue forecasting is obviously a challenging and very consequential line of work that is often unfairly scrutinized and criticized by those who don't understand the painstaking efforts to go into the report that we've just received. And you have done a tremendous job, along with the team of the Revenue Monitoring Committee, which is made up of legislative staff, gubernatorial staff, and the treasurer's staff, and us in the comptroller's office. It's simply remarkable that you're able to deliver a message that is clear in an unprecedented public health, economic, and fiscal emergency. Almost every state is going through the roller coaster that we are, up and down based on unpredictable future courses of action. But the pace and manner in which our economy and our lives return to some semblance of normalcy, which we all fervently hope for, it's going to be determined by the progress we make in combating the virus. Let's be honest. And since we issued our May fiscal guidance, a lot has happened at the state and federal levels that have influenced our economic and fiscal health. I have no doubt in my mind that these numbers will continue to evolve and fluctuate in the coming months, heading up to our December estimates, which will be extraordinarily important. Revenue forecasting in a COVID world is like asking a weather forecaster to pinpoint the precise location where the tornado will hit. We know it's going to hit. The question is where and when and how devastating will the result be. So I want to just express my sincere gratitude to the BRE staff and everyone on the team for the great work that they're doing under extraordinary circumstances. We're being asked to approve today fiscal year 2021 estimates totaling $18.7 billion, fiscal year 2022 estimates totaling $19.7 billion. While some may view these higher than expected revenue projections as indicators that our economy is on the path of recovery, it's critical that we're clear-eyed about what factors contributed to these numbers, because we remain, frankly, in a period of economic and fiscal volatility as our state, nation, and world continue to battle the COVID-19 pandemic. When compared to the May fiscal guidance that was issued by this board with unanimous concurrence, this represents a $1.4 billion increase for fiscal year 2021 and a $2.1 billion increase for fiscal year 2022, which starts next July. When compared to the March official estimates, today's revenue projections represent a $672.6 million reduction for fiscal year 2021. As you noted, the federal direct stimulus payments, the Paycheck Protection Program, and the $600 federal weekly unemployment subsidy worked as they were intended. They temporarily prevented what could have been a catastrophic economic crash for all the states in our great country. Absent the federal aid package that passed in the spring to assist families, small businesses, and the more than 1.1 million Marylanders who have filed for first-time unemployment, our experts believe this revenue outlook would have been far worse. The revenue figures we're reporting today highlight the tremendous success of the federal stimulus programs and underscores the need for a second round as we head into a winter of public health and economic uncertainty. We need to not only infuse more federal financial assistance to our small businesses, unemployed citizens, and working families, but we need to rebuild both the confidence and the purchasing power of the American consumer, and particularly our Maryland consumers. Without a second stimulus package, we're taking a tremendous economic risk. The reality is we don't know what awaits us in the coming months as the flu season coincides with this deadly novel virus that continues to infect and kill Marylanders and Americans every day. We don't know if a second economic shutdown will be necessary to prevent a resurgence in COVID cases. And if it is, and Congress fails to enact a second stimulus package, the worst case scenarios that we've been able to prevent from happening will most likely come to fruition, sadly. It's important to note that despite the critical inflow of cash that small businesses receive through PPP loans, with a few others receiving additional aid through state and local grant and loan programs, our sales and use tax revenues took a hit, amplifying the fact that so many of our small businesses have shuttered their doors for good. And so many more are struggling to keep the lights on as consumers remain wary to resume their in-person spending habits and shopping habits. We as a state, quite literally, cannot afford to see more of our small businesses shut down for good. And as we approach the fall and winter months with all the looming public health and economic uncertainties on the horizon, in my opinion, as comptroller of the state, we must immediately utilize our $585.8 million general fund balance for a small business rescue and stimulus plan. Since the state of emergency was declared back in March, I've talked with hundreds of small business owners, all of whom have pivoted their business models, adapted to ever-changing rules to ensure customer safety, employed creative strategies, done everything they can to stay in business. According to most credible forecasters, 50 to 80% of our restaurants are going to fail in the absence of real help from here on out. and we cannot and must not let that happen. And I'm reminded that the state of Maryland offered at one point up to $8.5 billion to entice Amazon to build its East Coast headquarters in our state. These were infrastructure improvements. We can and should and must invest a much smaller amount, the positive fund balance, $585.8 million, to save locally owned businesses that have done so much for our state. Let's be clear, if these brick and mortar stores along our main streets, it's not the global corporate companies all the time. It's these small Main Street businesses that fuel our state's economic success. It's our family-owned local businesses, not the corporate behemoths, that have deeply rooted connections and relationships within our communities through the jobs they've created, the investments they've made, the ecosystems of vendors and suppliers that they support. I often say to people around the state, these small businesses have been loyal to Maryland, and Maryland needs to step up right now to have its own small business relief plan. Fortunately, we can do that without invading the $1.2 billion rainy day fund, although I'm certainly encourage people to think about taking half of that in addition for small businesses. We can just spend this $585.8 million. We can do it. The money is there. It's in the state's checking account. The governor obviously is unbelievably supportive of small businesses, and I hopefully he will agree that he is the person to step up and do this. I've called on the governor and the General Assembly, but I think primarily given the emergency, it's really up to the governor to help our small businesses survive this economic nightmare. I'd like to once again, in conclusion, emphasize that the revenue estimates we're approving today must not be interpreted as a sign that this economic downturn is soon coming to an end. And as I've stated several times now, we simply don't know enough about what lies ahead in the coming months. We must continue to remain long-term fiscally cautious as the administration begins constructing the fiscal year 2022 budget and as legislators consider various policy programs for the upcoming legislative session. It's impossible to responsibly craft sound public policy when we don't know where the state is heading fiscally. So once again, let me thank Mr. Farkas, his team, and the Revenue Monitoring Committee for the tireless work they put into developing these estimates. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues, Treasurer Kopp and Secretary Brinkley, who I have such high regard for. Treasurer Kopp, if you wish to make a comment or have questions for Mr. Farkas.
Sorry. I want to thank you, Comptroller, in thanking David Farkas for the work that he's done and the way he has pulled together the team, including representatives of course, the Comptroller's Office, the Department of Budget, the Office of State Treasurer, and the General Assembly. And say that we do look forward to the December meeting for all the reasons which Mr. Farkas has said. These are difficult times, and it's difficult to project. And I think that we are all very thankful that neither the very dire projections of April, which you announced, Comptroller, or the better but more difficult ones of May have not come true. And in fact, we are very close to the estimates that the board had in March. That's good news of a resilient economy and a strong Maryland. But we don't know what's coming. We don't know what the federal government will be doing. We don't know what will be happening if we have another wave of pandemic. So it's very good to have these good, strong numbers, but also to realize that things change and that it's the numbers in December which are really going to be most significant for this coming fiscal budget. I would also remark on something that David touched on, and that is how these numbers, including the surprising resiliency and the strong withholding and personal income numbers, do reflect an economy with very significant differences and disparities. A lot of the strength is due to a strong middle class, a strong professional class, a strong, well-educated community. But we also have people who work equally hard, if not harder. The essential workers who are not paid well. And when they are unemployed, the numbers that are reflected in withholding only tell a small part of the story. There are too many people who are not strongly employed, who are not well trained enough, and when they are well trained, the jobs aren't there. So we have a lot of work to do in our economy, I believe, to bridge these differences and to make us a strong whole economy. But we do have a strong base to grow on, and I believe we will. So thank you, Mr. Farkas, and thank you, Comptroller.
Mr. Secretary.
Good afternoon. I hope that my technology maintains its integrity here so that I can complete these comments. I trust that you can hear me now. So, but I want to thank you, Mr. Comptroller. Thank you, Madam Treasurer. Mr. Farkas, thank you for your report, and also everybody in the Revenue Monitoring Committee, because particularly with the challenges we've had all summer, they've been trying to monitor all the details, all the numbers as time goes on, digest them, and try to interpret exactly what some of these subtle changes mean, and some of the changes were not so subtle. So today we are narrowing the potential window of our revenue projections for this year and next. It appears our revenues will come in higher than anticipated in our May conversation, yet still lower, and Mr. Comptroller, I think you pointed this out, than the official March projection. Therefore, while we managed well with the volatility and the uncertainty, we still need to remain very, very vigilant. We continue to operate in an environment of tremendous volatility, and circumstances could change again just as quickly. I urge anyone who interprets these updated projections to approach these figures with the utmost of caution. We've seen how volatile the virus can be, which translates directly into how volatile our economy and subsequently our revenue picture will be for the next 2 or even 3 years. If we're not dutiful in our adherence to the CDC's public health guidelines, we could see Maryland's infection numbers spike into dangerous territory, risking a further slide in the economy and voiding our progress. Moreover, while the Revenue Monitoring Work Group has practically perfected this task under normal conditions, the situation created by the coronavirus on our economy is so unique that variables we had never considered will continue to impact future projections. And as the Comptroller had referenced, all states are experiencing a similar volatility, which to me says that the science of revenue projection has been totally upended. Yes, our new revenue estimates are higher than the dire projections in May's guidance meeting, and we are increasing those projections a great deal here today. But they, again, are only estimates and still substantially lower than March's official projections. And while I'm going off script here, I know the Treasurer referenced this, the December numbers are what we'll actually have to utilize as we submit the budget for FY22. We are in balance now because of 3 principal things. Our FY20 closeout, Mr. Comptroller, which you referenced, the foresight of Governor Hogan to propose, and the members of the Board of Public Works with me here today to adopt the necessary budget reduction steps at the beginning of the fiscal year, and the governor's steady plan to reopen Maryland businesses as quickly, but I want to emphasize as safely as possible. Combined, these actions have put the state on a footing to consider this billion-dollar deficit manageable, and that too may be a stretch. In May, when we received the bleak revenue outlook as a result of this pandemic, we had no idea of the impact billions in federal stimulus dollars would be on our state's revenue. We see that answer in today's number. My concern is that these revenue projections may reflect, and these were the governor's words when we had a conversation with him last Friday, a sugar high rather than anything economically sustainable in the near term. The most stark example is the unemployment insurance payments. Unemployed workers in Maryland received an extra $600 per week from the federal government, and that subsidy was recently reduced to $300 per week. And as of tomorrow, that income source dries up. We must consider that our current revenues are the result of all the federal stimulus dollars being thrown at the state. And with the availability of federal funds soon coming to an end, we must be cautious in using the last 6 months of revenue to predict the next 6 months, much less the next year of revenue. This is the perfect reality check. Previous revenue projections proved wildly volatile. Perhaps because of an improvement compared to May's figures, some will say, well, they're not all that bad. In reality, it is very concerning going forward. Many people, households, families are still underemployed or unemployed. The vast majority of businesses are operating at less than 100% capacity, and many are only able to operate at 50% capacity. And our budget remains out of balance because the state's revenue base is nowhere near where it was before coronavirus struck, nor can we accurately predict what will be the source of our future revenues, economic activity, which we all hope for, or federal assistance. So while it may be objectively accurate that the situation isn't as bad as the guidance issued in May, I hope everyone watching and listening understands the situation is very precarious and critical. Because we need everyone on board as we continue making truly difficult decisions. I've said it before in other comments, but it bears repeating here. And you can tell the person who kind of created these, the outline of my talking point, Madam Treasurer, is very much into theater. So, but Nick indicates that FY 2020 was the prologue. The last quarter of the economic downturn was buoyed by an exceptionally strong growth in the first 3 quarters of that year. So unlike previously believed, we didn't have to tap into our reserves to balance the budget at the end of June. FY 2021 is Act 1. While we have now gotten through this first quarter, we still have 3 more quarters of this fiscal year, a slowdown or possibly even a cessation of federal stimulus money, and more importantly, continued uncertainty about the impact the pandemic will continue to have on our economy and therefore our employment base. And while we reduced the budget by $400 million on July 1st, when it would have certainly the greatest impact, we are still looking at a combined $1 billion in the red for the next 2 fiscal years. FY 22, we can consider Act 2. And it will be the greatest fiscal challenge our state will have ever faced. We are already working together across state agencies, across the branches of government, and across party lines in order to meet our constitutional duty to balance the state budget as well as to continue to provide essential services to the citizens of Maryland. We will see if there's an Act 3 or even an Act 4 going forward. Thank you again, Mr. Comptroller, Madam Treasurer, Mr. Farkas, and your team for the report that you had today. And I appreciate the opportunity to deliver these remarks. And I'll close with just adding that I've gotten my flu shot for the year to help us dampen the curve. I hope everybody else out there is in a position to get their flu shot too, so that we don't combine the complications of the flu on top of the medical community having to deal with the coronavirus.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Very good advice, frankly, on the flu vaccine. And thank you for your eloquent, excellent statement, as was that of Treasurer Nancy Kopp. I thought yours kind of edged everything out, though, Secretary Brinkley. It was almost Shakespearean with Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. But thank you for the eloquence. I would like to make a motion that the board submit a revised estimate of general fund revenues for fiscal year 2021 of $18.710 billion and an estimate of $19.666 billion for fiscal year 2022. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed or comments? Thank you very much. We are all available, I believe. The press is interested in asking questions. I think we've given everybody contact information, and they are welcome to call after this. As far as members of the public, we also will be available for any questions that may be sent to us via email, if that is in your liking. I hope everybody was able to navigate all of the technology that permits us to have these kind of virtual meetings. Thank you all. I think we're going to
Thank you. And thank you again, David Farkas.
Yes, David.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
David is stepping in to take the place of an iconic Andy Schoffel. So it's big shoes to fill. He's done a fabulous job. And thank you very much. Great presentation today. Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Concho. Thank you. Thank you, members of the board. I appreciate it.